11:47 p.m., the apartment door is open, not wide, just enough for the warm hallway light to spill onto the carpet, where footprints, wet and dark, lead the way inside. The first officer steps in and stops. There's blood everywhere, across the walls, across the floor, on the shattered stem of a wine glass, sticky underfoot. In the center of the living room stands a woman, barefoot, covered in red. Her hands tremble, a kitchen knife slipping in her grip as if her body can't decide whether to hold it or let it go. She is screaming, not words, not anything that makes sense, just raw, broken sounds. And behind her, on the floor, a man, motionless, stabbed so many times they can't tell at first how many wounds are there. The official count will be 108. The police will later call this the worst scene they've seen in years. But this didn't happen all at once. No one walked into that apartment expecting blood. Just 4 hours earlier, it was a date. Wine, jazz, soft laughter. Two people, Bryn Spejcher and Chad O'Melia, who barely knew each other. They were supposed to be getting closer. 10:32 p.m. Bryn takes one last hit from the bong on Chad's coffee table. She isn't a smoker, not really. She tells him she's fine. She smiles. But the truth? Something is wrong. Something in her head starts to tilt, just slightly, like the world is no longer where it should be. And in the next hour, everything will collapse. The laughter, the wine, the face she thinks she knows. And by the time it's over, there will be no clear memory of what happened. Only blood, terror, and a story that will haunt everyone who hears it. It didn't start like a horror story. It started like something simple, almost sweet. Two people, barely more than strangers, crossing paths on an ordinary day. Bryn Spejcher was the kind of woman who stayed out of the noise. 32 years old, with a quiet life built around her work as an audiologist. She was polite, composed, the kind of person you'd trust to guide you through a bad moment. Chad O'Melia was different. He was only 26, but carried himself with an easy confidence, the type of energy that fills a room without trying. Friends described him as fun-loving, with a taste for music and good times. They weren't an obvious pair, but life has a way of placing people in each other's paths, even when they're heading in opposite directions. Their first 2 dates were safe, the kind of getting-to-know-you moments everyone expects. Coffee shops, quick lunches, the guarded conversations where both people are still deciding if this is something real or just another evening with a polite goodbye. Chad made her laugh. He had this casual way of making her feel like she could breathe, like she didn't have to overthink what to say. Bryn, who spent most of her time working or tucked into her own routine, found it refreshing. No drama, no red flags, just two adults sharing space and time. By the time the third date rolled around, Bryn felt comfortable, not in love, not even close, but enough to say yes when Chad invited her over. Just a quiet night, he promised. Homemade dinner, a bottle of wine, music on in the background. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening. Chad's condo sat in a quiet Thousand Oaks neighborhood, the kind of place that looked almost too peaceful under the night sky. The porch light glowed warm against the concrete walkway. When Bryn stepped inside, the air smelled like something fresh from the kitchen. Basil, warm bread, maybe garlic. A glass of red wine was waiting for her. The lights were low, but not uncomfortably so, with soft jazz humming from a small speaker on the counter. Everything felt normal. They ate together, swapping small stories. Her long day at work, his plans for the weekend. He was charming, but not in that forced, try-too-hard way. Just easy, relaxed. Dinner turned to wine. Wine turned to the couch. The music kept playing. At some point, Chad asked if she wanted to smoke. A bong sat neatly on the coffee table, the glass reflecting the candlelight. Bryn wasn't a smoker, not really. A few experiments in college, nothing that ever stuck. But she didn't want to seem stiff, and Chad, smiling that calm, confident smile, assured her it would be fine. Just one hit, he said, just to relax. She hesitated, but in the end, she said yes. The first hit was soft. A cough, a laugh, the warm rush in her chest. The second came easier. The third. Well, that's when the night began to change. It was subtle at first. The wine glass in her hand felt heavier. The edges of the room seemed softer, almost blurred. She told herself it was fine. She was fine. But deep down, something in her body disagreed. Her heart started to pick up speed. The jazz, the same quiet music she'd barely noticed, suddenly felt too loud, like the notes were pressing in on her ears. Chad noticed something shift in her expression. "You okay?" he asked, leaning closer. She smiled, or tried to. "Yeah, I think so." But the truth? Something wasn't right. Minutes stretched strangely. The second glass of wine tasted different, almost too sweet. Or maybe that was her mind playing tricks. She felt detached, like her thoughts were moving through molasses, like she was watching herself from across the room. Still, she said nothing. She didn't want to ruin the night. She didn't want to sound paranoid. But something dark was stirring beneath the surface, a feeling that this wasn't just a high. This was something else, something she couldn't control. Later, Bryn would tell investigators that she remembered flashes, moments where she felt trapped in her own body, her mind racing while her hands felt foreign, like they weren't even hers anymore. But at 10:30 p.m., she just sat there, smiling, trying to pretend the world wasn't already starting to tilt. By the time the clock struck 10:32, Bryn was no longer in control. The laughter, the warmth of the wine, even Chad's voice, all of it would soon twist into something unrecognizable. And within the hour, this quiet night would erupt into chaos. The knife wasn't supposed to mean anything. It was just there, lying on the counter, glinting faintly in the low light. But in Bryn's mind, now twisted, fragmented, and drowning in fear, it wasn't just a kitchen tool anymore. It was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that could keep her safe from whatever Chad had suddenly become in her eyes. Her breathing was shallow, rapid. The room wasn't still anymore. The air felt alive, humming like an electrical current against her skin. Chad was speaking again, his voice calm but firm, telling her to sit down, to breathe. He was worried, maybe even scared. But Bryn's mind wasn't hearing the words anymore. They came out warped, broken, like the sound was bending around her. She took a step back, then another. Her hand trembled as it hovered over the knife. Later, she would tell investigators she didn't remember making the decision to grab it. She didn't remember much of anything at all. But the security of cold steel in her hand, that she remembered. That felt like control in a world that had slipped entirely out of focus. Chad reached for her, not in anger, but in concern. Hey, calm down, it's me. You're just too high, you're safe." But the moment his hand moved toward her, Bryn's brain snapped. A switch was flipped. To her, he wasn't Chad anymore. He was someone else, something else. The first strike was sudden, panicked. The knife cut across his arm. He yelled, stepping back, shocked not just by the pain, but by the look in her eyes. Wide, wild, unrecognizable. "Bryn, stop!" He tried to grab her wrists, tried to get the knife away. But fear is powerful. And in that moment, Bryn was beyond reason. Her mind was gone, lost in something called cannabis-induced psychosis, a rare but real reaction where paranoia, hallucinations, and terror take over completely. She didn't see Chad anymore. She saw an enemy, a threat that had to be destroyed. What happened next can only be described as a frenzy. She lashed out, stabbing, cutting, swinging in blind panic. Chad tried to block her, tried to escape, but the condo's small layout left him cornered. The living room became chaos. Furniture knocked over, the wine glass shattered on the floor, blood smearing across the walls. Chad screamed for her to stop. He begged her, but she couldn't hear him. Neighbors would later say they heard shouting, then silence, then a sound like heavy, frantic movement. No one opened their doors. No one intervened. By the time it was over, Chad lay on the floor, his body still. Bryn, trembling, her hands slick with blood, stood over him with the knife. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, each one catching like a sob. The fog didn't lift immediately. In fact, Bryn didn't even seem to realize what she had done. She stood there muttering nonsense, trapped in her own spiraling nightmare as the seconds dragged on. It would take the scream, her own screams, to bring the neighbors to their doors. They would call 911. And when the first officer stepped inside, they would find her exactly as she was, barefoot, blood-soaked, shaking, the knife still in her hand like it was fused to her skin. 108 wounds. That's what the medical examiner would later count on Chad O'Melia's body. But in that moment, it didn't feel like numbers. It felt like a room frozen in shock, a night that had slipped into something unspeakable. When police tried to talk to her, Bryn wasn't Bryn anymore. She was someone else, lost in a haze of fear, hallucinations, and fragments of reality. What happened in the next few hours would leave detectives shaken and the community stunned. When the first officer entered Chad's condo, the scene was unrecognizable. The warm, inviting apartment, the one that had held wine, jazz, and quiet laughter just hours before, now looked like something torn straight out of a nightmare. There was blood on the walls, smeared across the floor, the shattered remains of a wine glass stuck to the carpet like shards of ice. Furniture was overturned, and in the center of it all stood Bryn Spejcher. Her body was trembling violently. Her face was pale, streaked with tears and sweat, and her hands were still gripping the kitchen knife, not tightly, not in defiance, but like she didn't know how to let it go. The officer called out to her, but she didn't respond. Her lips were moving, but there were no words. Just broken sounds, fragments of a scream that seemed to have burned her voice out from the inside. Behind her, Chad lay motionless. His body was covered in wounds, too many to count in that moment. The sheer violence of it stunned even the most seasoned responders. Later, when the official count came in, 108 stab wounds, detectives would say it was one of the most brutal crime scenes they had ever documented. The officer ordered Bryn to drop the knife. She didn't. Not because she was resisting, but because she was gone. Her eyes were vacant, unfocused, as though she wasn't even aware of where she was. When backup arrived, it took 3 officers to safely disarm and restrain her. Even then, she kept trembling, crying, mumbling incoherent phrases. She wasn't aggressive. She wasn't fighting. She was just broken. They led her out of the apartment, past the hallway now filled with neighbors peeking through their doors, whispering, terrified. At the station, Bryn was barely responsive. She sat in the interview room with her head down, unable to form clear sentences. Police described her as disoriented and incoherent. Her mind fractured in a way that made it almost impossible to tell what she understood. Toxicology tests would later reveal that she had no other drugs in her system, just cannabis. But for Bryn, that was enough. She had suffered what experts call cannabis-induced psychosis, a rare but severe reaction that can trigger hallucinations, paranoia, and violent episodes in certain individuals. Detectives worked through the night. The story didn't make sense at first. There was no history of violence between Bryn and Chad, no signs of abuse, no prior arguments. Just 3 dates. 3 ordinary nights that ended in the kind of horror that feels impossible to explain. Friends and family were shocked. Chad's friends described him as kind, funny, and down to earth. Bryn's co-workers couldn't believe what they were hearing. They said she was calm, professional, the last person they'd expect to see in handcuffs. But the evidence was impossible to ignore. The blood, the wounds, the knife still warm in her hand. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't something that could be explained away with a single word. Something had gone terribly wrong in Bryn's mind, and now a young man's life was gone because of it. Hook to Part 5. In the days that followed, Bryn's name would be splashed across headlines. The story of a normal woman turned violent overnight shocked the country. And the courtroom battle that came next would force everyone to ask a single, haunting question. Was this murder or madness? In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire. Bryn Speicher's name was suddenly everywhere, plastered across headlines, whispered on talk shows, dissected on social media. People couldn't stop asking how a quiet, seemingly normal woman could commit something so brutal. The phrase 108 stab wounds became the line that made people stop and shudder. For investigators, this wasn't a simple case. There were no signs of premeditation. There was no evidence of a long simmering conflict between Bryn and Chad. To everyone who knew them, they were just 2 people who had met online and gone on a few dates. Nothing about this looked like murder, but then, what was it? When Bryn woke up in a holding cell the next morning, she didn't remember what she had done. The reality hit her in fragments, through blood-stained clothing, through the hollow way officers looked at her, through the words, "You killed him," that she couldn't process. She wept for hours. It wasn't a cry of guilt, not yet, but of confusion, of terror, of being unable to connect her memories to the images flashing in her mind. She remembered the wine, she remembered the bong, she remembered Chad smiling, and then nothing, just darkness. When experts examined her, they found no history of mental illness, no drugs in her system other than cannabis. Yet the signs were clear. She had experienced cannabis-induced psychosis, a rare condition where high THC levels can cause delusions, paranoia, and extreme violence in some users. The prosecution wanted to make the case straightforward. A crime this violent couldn't be written off as an accident. But the defense argued something different, that Bryn wasn't in control of herself, that she had been consumed by something she couldn't understand, and that the stabbing wasn't an act of intent, but of madness. In the courtroom, Bryn looked nothing like the person the headlines painted her to be. She was quiet, fragile, often in tears as the evidence was shown. The jury saw the crime scene photos, the blood on the walls, the shattered wine glass, the knife. And the reality hit harder than words ever could. Chad's family sat in silence, grief heavy on their faces. They had lost a son, a brother, a friend. No explanation would ever make that pain easier to carry. The expert witnesses were divided. Some said cannabis psychosis is real, that Bryn's reaction, though extreme, was possible. Others claimed that nothing in her system should have led to this level of violence, that there had to be something more. For Bryn, the weight of the trial wasn't just the legal battle. It was living with the knowledge of what she had done. Something she would later say felt like watching someone else's nightmare play out through my hands. Months dragged on. The verdict was complicated. Bryn was found guilty, but not of murder. Instead, the court recognized her condition, sentencing her to probation and mandatory mental health treatment rather than prison time. The decision sparked outrage in some circles. How could someone who inflicted so many wounds walk free? But others pointed to the medical evidence, the rarity of her condition, and the fact that she wasn't a violent person before or after that night. Bryn never spoke to the media. Her life became a shadow of what it once was, lived quietly and carefully, haunted by memories she could never fully trust. Friends said she hardly left her home. She carried guilt like a second skin, writing letters to Chad's family she never sent. Letters where she begged them to understand that she never wanted this, never meant for it to happen. The story of Bryn Spejcher and Chad O'Melia remains one of those cases that people can't stop talking about. Not because of its gore, but because of its chilling unpredictability. Two ordinary people, one ordinary night, and a single choice that led to an unimaginable tragedy. Some stories stay with you not because of monsters or myths, but because they remind us that sometimes the most terrifying things come from within. If you've made it this far, I want to know, where are you watching this from? Comment your city or country below and tell me, what's the scariest true story you've ever heard?